Well, I'm really glad that you've been able to join us in this way this Christmas Eve. Our church is saving a lot of money on hot chocolate and coffee and donuts and a theater rental. I mean, obviously we would be very happy to pay all that. We really miss you, and we really miss being together as a church family. But in terms of online services, this is pretty good. And that's thanks, first of all, to God, who gives us gifts and abilities. But second of all, it's thanks to two people in particular, Rodrigo and Tati. Rodrigo's our media director. Tati's our children's ministry director. They're married. They've worked together a ton on what you're seeing today. And as far as I can tell, they're still talking to each other. So that's good. But they are just servant-hearted people who have been such a gift to us as a church and just go above and beyond. And so I would encourage you, if you've been blessed, encouraged at all by what you've participated in today, then reach out to them and let them know how appreciated they are. We also want to thank the kids who, some of them have been working for months on this already. They braved some really bad weather to share the Christmas story with us through song and dance in a fresh way. Thank you to the parents, and a special shout out to Rob, because I don't know very many people in our church who would be willing to do a rap on video. I mean, I would be, but I don't think anybody wants to see that. So thank you so much to Rob and to others who have helped out. I know Kira and Kenna have been awesome with helping with the kids as well. So thank you. Today I want to talk about Easter eggs. And partly that's because I kind of wish that it was Easter, that we could just fast forward the next like 3 or 4 months of winter and COVID. But I'm not actually talking about the kind of Easter eggs that you hide in your lawn on Easter, but instead the kind that you find in movies. If you have never heard of them before, Easter eggs are these subtle, hidden elements in movies that you have to watch really carefully to see, and you need to have a special knowledge to actually appreciate. A couple of examples. In the movie Catch Me If You Can, which is Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks, Leo DiCaprio plays Frank Abagnale, who is a con artist, and he's being pursued by Tom Hanks's character. And at the end of the movie, Frank Abagnale gets arrested. But what I didn't know, and what you maybe didn't know either, is that the actual real life Frank Abagnale, because it's based on a true story, the actual Frank Abagnale is one of the policemen in the movie doing the arresting. They worked him into the movie actually, which is kind of cool. Another example, Star Wars Episode 1, also known as the Jar Jar Binks movie. Misa, so happy to see you. You're so watching this movie and you'll regret it. That was my voice acting audition tape right there. Star Wars Episode 1. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, is apparently really good friends with Steven Spielberg, the creator of E.T. and other movies. And in Star Wars Episode 1, there's like a scene of the Galactic United Nations, and one of the delegations of like aliens, if you watch closely and carefully, is actually a bunch of little E.T. lookalikes, which is apparently Lucas's shout out to Steven Spielberg. So these Easter eggs, it's not like you need to know them to get the gist of the message. You understand the message of the movie, but it adds this layer of depth and meaning that you wouldn't otherwise have as a fan. And I think we see that kind of thing in the Bible too. I mean, when you read the scriptures, when you read the story of Jesus' birth, you can get the main message, no problem. But there are these Easter eggs, these hidden elements, these allusions to other stories and passages that are right there under the surface. And when you start to understand them, you realize these Easter eggs are not trivial or superficial. They're actually deeply meaningful, and they help us understand the story as a whole. And Matthew especially does this in his telling of the birth of Jesus. But he doesn't keep it hidden so much. He's more like a dad who's doing an Easter egg hunt for his 1-year-old, and you put the egg right in the middle of the field, and you stand there and you go, hey, look over here. You should look over here. I bet you there's something over here that you'd like. It's kind of what Matthew does. A few times in Matthew 2, the chapter that deals with Jesus' birth, Matthew plants some Easter eggs and says, hey, you should camp out here. You should dig a little bit deeper into this. The first of those is when Matthew tells us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And at first you might go, okay, well that's a random name of a place in an area of the world that I don't really know very well. It seems like a non-essential detail. Moving on. But Matthew would say, wait a second. Take a look at what's actually here. Bethlehem, if you if you know E.T. and you watch Star Wars, if you've read your Old Testament and you come to the birth of Jesus, you might know that Bethlehem was the birthplace of King David, the great king of Israel. But not only that, Bethlehem was the place that a prophet named Micah had said that the Messiah would come from. And Matthew quotes that there when he talks about Bethlehem. He says, this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So there's Easter egg number one. Bethlehem is not just a random place. It's actually the birthplace of King David and the place that prophets from hundreds of years before Jesus had said that the Messiah, the coming king, would come from. That information comes to us because a bunch of magi, the wise men, the three wise men coming from the east, they're inquiring about where this newborn king is. And Herod, the current king, isn't a fan of this at all. He's not excited about some mysterious newborn king, and he decides he's going to do something dastardly. How do you like that word? He's going to do something dastardly about it. But before he can, an angel appears to Joseph and tells Joseph to take Mary and the child Jesus and flee to Egypt. Now again, you read that and you go, okay, that sounds rough. I mean, to be forced to flee as refugees from your home because of a potentially murderous tyrant. We know that happens in the world. And we can't imagine what that would be like. That's really, really hard. But Matthew doesn't want us to just leave it at that. He wants us again to dig deeper. He's left an Easter egg here, right? He's got a big neon sign flashing. No, look deeper into this. Especially with the mention of Egypt. And he actually says in verse 15, so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now what Matthew is quoting there is the prophet Hosea in the Old Testament, Hosea 11, verse 1. And in that passage, Hosea is not actually talking about anything in the future. He's not talking about the Messiah. He's not talking about an individual son of God. He's talking about something that's happened in the past. He's talking about the Exodus. He's talking about how the Israelites were slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and God loved Israel like a son, and God brought Israel out of Egypt, called Israel out of Egypt, saved and delivered Israel out of Egypt. When Matthew quotes Hosea, when he says, hey, there's this connection here, he's not saying that Hosea was thinking about Jesus, but instead that Jesus is a fulfillment of the kind of thing that Hosea was talking about. That Jesus, this individual, is the embodiment of Israel, that Jesus in key ways is going to relive the story of Israel, that Jesus is the Son of God in a truer sense than even Israel was, and that Jesus is going to bring about another Exodus, another work of salvation, of deliverance, but this one is going to be even farther reaching, even greater than the first one. And this Exodus as well is going to have a geographical root in Egypt. See, Matthew's saying this isn't a coincidental detail. Look closely. There's a deeper purpose in Jesus spending time in Egypt. And then the third Easter egg, as we're calling them, comes when Herod actually does do his dastardly thing. Herod orders every boy under the age of 2 in Bethlehem to be killed. He wants to eliminate this threat of a potential king. A third Easter egg, as we're calling it, Matthew doesn't say that, but you know what I mean, comes when Herod actually does his dastardly deed. In the part of the story that's definitely not family friendly and that isn't usually portrayed in a Christmas pageant, Herod orders that every boy under the age of 2 in Bethlehem be killed. He wants to eliminate every possible threat to his own reign. And Matthew says this as well. There's something deeper going on here. He says it actually fulfills what Jeremiah the prophet said. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Now this one's a little bit trickier, but try to stay with me here. At first it doesn't seem like the connection is very obvious. Jeremiah 31 doesn't actually say anything about children being killed, which is what is happening in Matthew 2. Ramah is a totally different place than Bethlehem. But once again, Matthew's kind of telling us, slow down here. Pause the frame, dig deep, see what's going on. If you dig more deeply, you find out that Ramah was the place where the Jewish exiles were gathered in 586 BC. The Babylonians were the powerful empire. They overcame the Jews. They overcame Jerusalem, and they gathered the Jewish exiles in Ramah before taking them to Babylon. And Jeremiah, the prophet, was one of those exiles. In which case, Rachel is weeping for her children. And by the way, Rachel was Jacob's wife. Jacob was one of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, also known as Israel. He had 12 sons, 12 tribes of Israel. So Rachel's kind of one of these matriarchs. So she's weeping, not because her children are dying, but because her children are being exiled from their homeland because of this foreign power. And now once again, you have Jesus, Israel embodied, remember, who is being exiled from his homeland because of the tyrannical rule of a foreigner, of a non-Israelite, like Herod. Herod wasn't fully an Israelite. So you've got that going on. Then you dig even deeper and you see that Jeremiah 31 is actually a passage that's all about hope and joy, because this exile is not going to be forever. It's temporary, and the promise, the prophetic promise, is that Israel's children are going to come back. There's going to be a return. And so is Matthew telling us right here that while Jesus is being exiled from his homeland, that he is going to return, that this isn't the end of the story, and in fact, that Jesus is going to bring about a return from exile for many others who are held in captivity to forces that are even greater than Babylon, greater than Rome, greater than Herod, forces like sin and death. You see the connections. You see how these aspects are embedded into the story, and they're not just coincidences. These aspects of the birth of Jesus are not just random happenings. There is deep meaning and purpose in all of it. And in that way, we could actually even say that it's not just that these are like Easter eggs that kind of give us a deeper meaning or appreciation. We could use another movie analogy here too. We could say that the coming of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, is the climax of the whole story. That you've got all of these different pieces of the story that don't seem to be totally connected, and Jesus brings it all together. He's the climax, he's the summary of God's story of his interactions with humanity. You've seen this in movies or shows. One of my favorite shows, I won't tell you which one it is so that it doesn't spoil it if you haven't seen it, but the very first episode of the show, the pilot episode, you follow through the episode these different characters, and they look different. They're in different life stages, and there's no sign that they're connected at all. They're just like you're following like these random people, and then in the last few minutes of that pilot episode, all of a sudden it all comes together, and it's mind blowing. Like the first time I watched it, I was like, what? I did not see that coming, but it makes so much sense now. It's that satisfying feeling of just like, wow, the way it all kind of came together. And that's a little bit, I think, of what the scriptures are like when you come to Jesus, that suddenly all these different pieces, these different aspects of the story, these different threads all come together in Jesus. He's the summary of this whole story. So you've got these two things going on in Jesus' coming, but particularly in his birth and the way that Matthew tells it. You've got these Easter eggs, which are these allusions that kind of point us to God's deeper purpose and meaning, that give a new layer of understanding for us. But those Easter eggs point to how Jesus is the climax and kind of the summary of all that has taken place, of God's whole story with humanity. And this has something to do with you as well this Christmas. Let's start with the idea of Jesus being the climax of the story. If Jesus is the climax of the whole human story and God's interaction with humanity, then I believe it's also true that he's the climax of every single individual story. There might be pieces of your life that you don't know how do they fit? What's their place in your story? Maybe it's a really difficult marriage, or maybe it's no marriage at all. Maybe it's work that you just are not passionate about, but yet you spend so much time doing. Maybe it's a traumatic experience from the past that still shapes you in the present. Maybe it's a personal characteristic or struggle that just frustrates you and you can't seem to break out of it. And you might wonder, why is this in my life? Well, when you put your faith in Jesus, I believe again that he becomes the purpose and the goal of all of this. Paul in Colossians 1 says that in him all things have been made, through him all things have been made, and for him all things have been made. All things have been made for him. He's the goal, he's the purpose. Ephesians 1 says that God has gifted his people with all kinds of gifts and abilities so that the whole people can be built up in maturity and attain to the full measure, the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. The fullness of Christ, the whole measure of that. That's the goal. And so when you put your trust in Jesus, the difficult marriage becomes an opportunity to become more like Jesus. The personal struggle becomes a place where you lean in a special way on his grace and his power, and you let him go to work. The traumatic experience from the past becomes an entry point into other people's lives to share with them about the grace of Jesus. Like the Bible as a whole, like any great story, Jesus sums up all these parts of your life that seem to be conflicting, that don't seem to fit, and gives deeper meaning and purpose to them. And let's talk about the Easter egg theme as well. Again, there are all these aspects in the birth of Jesus that point us to God's purposes and Jesus' own identity. And I think, again, that's true of our lives particularly too. The whole earth is full of God's glory. That's what the prophet Isaiah said. He had this vision of the temple. The temple in Jerusalem was like the center of God's glory. Like if you wanted to go to God's presence, that's where you went. And in this vision, he saw the presence of the Lord, but he said he saw these seraphim, these angelic figures singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." The earth, you look around, is full of his glory. His fingerprints are all over his creation. And if that's true, then his fingerprints and his glory are all over your life as well. God has planted all of these Easter eggs in your life. You could pass by them. You might not pay any attention to them, but there are these aspects, these elements of your life that point to your identity in Christ, that point to who he is and what he's done in your life. Even now, this Christmas, I promise you, God is putting Easter eggs in your life, even with the year that we've had with all its struggles and shortcomings. He is present with you, and he is pointing you to himself in various ways. The question is, can you see that? Do you notice those those pointers can you ask him to show you? I want to show you something. It's a little video with a bunch of scenes of stories from the scriptures, and it all leads up to the birth of Jesus. And there's the song in the background is "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus," and it reinforces this point that all of the hopes and expectations and dreams and longings of God's people all pointed to Jesus. Again, it's not that the difficult things in our lives are caused by God or that we are helpless victims, but rather they take on, the difficulties, the challenges take on new meaning, new purpose in Him. And in that way, everything points to Him. It still does.
Expected Jesus, more to say.